What we call nerves are really just bundles of axons. For example, your sciatic nerve, this huge nerve that carries lots of is this huge nerve that carries lots of axons. These axons of the sciatic nerve, they descend your leg, and one by one they branch off of the big sciatic nerve and innervate the surrounding somatic tissues. When we encounter an axon in the peripheral nervous system, we call it a fiber. The fibers within a nerve can be motor, sensory, or both. So the sciatic nerve, it carries motor information to tissues of the leg, but it also carries sensory information from those tissues to the brain. Just as bone had the periosteum and those muscles had the three coverings of the endo, para, and epimysium, nerves also have three coverings. The epineurium covers the entire nerve, just as the epimysium enclose the entire muscle. Again, we have fascicles, right? These are fascicles, which are then surrounded by a perineurium. This microscopic picture over here, what you see, this is a fascicle. And it's surrounded by the dense connective tissue of the perineurium. These little circles on the top left and the bottom right of the fascicle are axons that are all wrapped in myelin and then wrapped by the endoneurium. So it's an extra wrapping, just like the endomysium was an extra wrapping. These lines here, do you see these lines that are like curving, right, in the middle of the fascicle? Those lines are also axons, but they've been cut on an oblique angle instead of on a straight up cross section. So those axons there are on an angle kind of like that. All of the little purple dots that you see in this fascicle are the darkly stained nuclei of Schwann cell nuclei, which were the neuroglia associated with each myelin wrapping. Right? So these wrappings, they don't just separate axons from themselves or axons from nearby tissues. Remember that these wrappings provide routes for things like blood vessels that you can see up there on the left, and lymph vessels, which is like an extra drainage system. First, I want to point out that we are going to use terms that we have used before when talking about vertebra. There will be a slight difference here because now we're not talking about vertebra, we're actually talking about the nerves that leave the spinal cord. So there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Yes, they're pairs because there's one nerve leaving the spinal cord on the left and one leaving the spinal cord on the right. I'm not being a jerk by mentioning that. Yeah. In short, there are 8 cervical spinal nerves that are shown here in orange. There are 12 thoracic spinal nerves that are shown here in green. There are 5 lumbar spinal nerves, and there are 5 sacral spinal nerves, and there is 1 coccygeal spinal nerve, which is not shown on this diagram because that's what you get for using open source materials. Buyer beware. The location of a spinal nerve can be very difficult for students to visualize. This right here, just that right there, and this right here, just those 2 little sections are a spinal nerve. And it's these spinal nerves that are trapped in a canal that kind of runs in between the 2 vertebrae. So this is what makes it really hard to visualize. I want you to think of another vertebra on top of this one and think of how the spinal cord, it's threaded through the space in between these vertebrae here with very little tiny bits, very small lengths of a spinal nerve that exits from between the vertebra. The next slide will help us visualize this even more. But I'm sorry, I do want to label these two things here. Those are the spinal nerves, the left and the right. And we also know that this is this is dorsal up here because this huge spinous process. Because spinal nerves exit between the vertebra, this means that you need those intervertebral discs to keep the vertebra spaced apart enough so that the nerve can exit unimpinged. And you can see that in many of these areas here. The vertebral disc is holding apart those vertebra, allowing those spinal nerves to leave. Most people can herniate discs while bending forward and lifting something heavy, especially if you put the fulcrum away from your body. By doing this in a bent over position, you put a lot of pressure on the ventral side of your intervertebral discs, most likely in the lumbar section. And what happens is you force the gooey center of the disc into the dorsal space where the spinal nerve is. You can see this herniation in the picture on the left, but you can also see this herniation in the picture on the right. By leaning forward, you've pushed the disc backwards, and now it's impinging upon the spinal nerve at that level. You have a pinched nerve, and it's a big nerve that you pinched. Motor and sensory functions in tissues that branch off from the spinal nerve would definitely be affected. Yes, you can totally fix herniations by removing the bulge of the disc. This simply alleviates the pressure on the nerve, but this also reduces the amount of overall tissue this disc has. Yes, it will heal, but the disc itself will be slightly shorter, which kind of means that you only get one discectomy. It's a rare occasion that people can have two discectomies. Usually if you get the one, it's your intervertebral disc is short enough that they don't want to take the chance of getting a second. It depends on the situation. But also, if your spine is already suffering from accelerated degenerative disc disease, there might not be enough height or enough tissue in your intervertebral disc to do this. And this is where spinal fusion comes into play. In spinal fusion, we remove this disc entirely, and we usually use an artificial spacer that we attach to this disc, and we attach to this disc. And this artificial spacer can be metal, it can be plastic, it can be a whole bunch of things. I actually found a doctor in Tennessee that uses breast implants as intervertebral discs. The problem is you only get about 7 years and then you need the surgery again. So it's not a permanent fix, but I thought that was pretty genius, right? But in spinal fusion, we say, okay, your discs can't hold apart these vertebrae anymore, and we're going to use an artificial spacer to do that. If you receive spinal fusion in the cervical and thoracic region, it's usually very successful. I'm not saying that spinal fusion in the lumbar region is not successful, but what happens, because these vertebrae are meant to take a lot of weight, what happens is this vertebra up here starts moving from left to right, trying to accommodate the lack of movement that the levels below it have. And that movement left to right now starts to compromise this vertebra. And it can easily create a bulging disc here. And now you need an intervertebral spacer here. And guess what happens after you get that one? This disc starts to move left to right. And you get a herniation here. And yes, this is what happens. My surgeon said, I will not do fusion for you. You'll just be back to me every 7 to 8 years, if not sooner, for another fusion. It was one opinion of many.